Hello, everybody. Welcome as people start to populate the Zoom room. Um, uh, just to introduce myself, my name is Jonathan Lincoln. I'm the director at the Center for Jewish Civilization. Today, we're extremely grateful to have with us Ambassador Dennis Ross. Ambassador Ross is, of course, well known to this crowd, but by way of brief introduction, he's counselor and distinguished fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Ambassador Ross has advised no less than five U.S. administrations on Middle East policy. He's also a distinguished professor of the practice of diplomacy here at Georgetown, and we're extremely lucky to have him on faculty at the Center for Jewish Civilization, where he teaches peacemaking in the Middle East and statecraft and negotiation in the Middle East. He's the author of several books on Israel, on the U.S.-Israel relationship, on mediation, statecraft, and negotiation. And we're truly grateful to have this conversation that we really put together just at the end of last week, of course, given the events in Gaza, and in particular the killing of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar, and what that might mean for the continuation of the war. So welcome, Ambassador Ross. And maybe if I could just start the discussion with you, we'll ask a few questions and then open it up to our audience who can ask questions through the Q&A function. Which is just on the bottom of your screen. But if I could just ask you to help us really better understand, what this means, what this moment means, and Yahya Sinwar's death in particular for Israel, for the United States and the Palestinians going forward. Thank you, Ambassador.
First, thanks for having me. I'm really glad to do this. I feel a strong connection to the university since I also teach there. And I think this is a good moment to be having this kind of a discussion. So let me deal with each of those questions in turn. What does it mean for Israel? At a certain level, it means there is an unmistakable emblem of victory and of success. I remember speaking in December. I was in Israel less than 2 months after after October 7, 2023, and I asked the question to all the senior people I met, including all the senior people in the security and political establishment. I asked the same question: how will you know when you've won? How are you defining victory? And in the security establishment, the intelligence establishment, the answer was very simple. They said there are 6 people who we have to get. And once we get that, we know we will have succeeded. Well, those 6 started with Yahya Sinwar. I can go through the others, but the point is they've gotten all of them now. And so from the standpoint of being able to have a symbol of victory, it was hard to have a symbol of victory so long as Sinwar was still there. Sinwar himself, the measure of victory was he survived. So you had, on the Israeli side, they had to be able to get Sinwar. They have Sinwar. Now, obviously, a win goes much beyond that, meaning Israel, in fact, has dismantled 23 of 24 Hamas battalions. It has destroyed more than half of all of the military infrastructure. When I say military infrastructure, I mean weapons depots, weapons labs, weapon production facilities, and the tunnels. So Hamas's ability to reconstitute itself, A, it's decimated as a military. B, it is also largely decimated from a support infrastructure standpoint, and C, it is in a position where if you want to prevent it from reconstituting itself, that's possible if you have real understandings on preventing smuggling from Egypt into Gaza. Many people used to refer to Gaza as being an open-air prison, and it was as it relates to the people who lived there, but it was not an open-air prison for Hamas. They got whatever they needed. They had 350 miles of tunnels that they built up. All that material could have been used to build Gaza above ground. Instead, it was used below ground. Those tunnels could have been used to protect Gazans from Israeli bombing. They weren't allowed to be part of that. That was only for Hamas. So they have got the leader who was responsible for October 7th, those like Mohammed Deif who designed it with him, A whole leadership cadre is gone. Much of the infrastructure is gone. The military itself, Hamas as a military, is gone. Preventing its reconstitution is possible. And you need a day after. And I think that's kind of where the U.S. comes in. But there are partners for that too, because the UAE has said very publicly they're prepared to be part of a stabilization force. And they're not just, in a sense, talking without any substance. We already know what they're doing on the ground in Gaza. They have bakeries in Gaza that are feeding 500,000 people a day. They have a field hospital in Gaza, which they provide the security for in coordination with the Israelis. So they're ready to come in as part of a stabilization force, which means there really is a potential for a day after where you build some kind of regional / international transitional administration. So for us, it means there is, I think, an opportunity here to try to use diplomacy to bring the war to an end. It is in our interest to remind Prime Minister Netanyahu, you've got great military achievements right now. And if you combine it with what's happened with Hezbollah, not only getting Sinwar, but getting Nasrallah before that, you have great intelligence achievements. You don't have political outcomes. If you don't turn these great achievements into political outcomes, they will not have strategic consequence. So there is an opening here to do quite a bit. There has to be a recognition of the importance of bringing the war to an end in a way that allows Israel to have dealt not only with the threat, but to be able to produce a pathway forward that offers something quite different for Palestinians as well. I'll just conclude with you asked what about for the Palestinians? One thing we know about, there's a Ziegler poll that was recently done, and it showed 7% of Gazans would like Hamas to remain in control. 7%. That's almost within the margin of error. It tells you there's a great deal of anger at Hamas. There were celebrations which didn't get the kind of visibility they should have gotten. Celebrations in Gaza when it was announced that Sinwar was killed. That speaks volumes about what the real attitude of Gazans are. That's also something you don't want Israel to stay in Gaza. The longer it stays in Gaza, the focus shifts back entirely to what Israel's doing and not so much what Hamas is doing.
Thank you so much. I mean, just to sort of press you on that a little bit on the Palestinian side, I mean, obviously one of the issues thinking about the day after is, of course, you know, you mentioned the possibility of a greater Arab role, whether in terms of a force or engagement on the ground. But what about the Palestinian Authority, or what about some entity connected to the Palestinian Authority? Just given the PA's, international identity in some ways, holding the seat of the non-permanent member state of the UN. I know it doesn't necessarily resonate so much for an American audience, but also thinking, forward about the way that the Europeans and others might actually put money for the reconstruction of Gaza. What role and what challenges do we see with the role of the Palestinian Authority?
Look, it's not only an excellent question, it's an important question. And the reason it's important is because even the UAE, which requires reform in the PA, wants to be asked by the Palestinian Authority to go in to Gaza. The UAE and others, Egypt undoubtedly will go in. There may be others as well. They will want to look like they're being asked by Palestinians to come in to, in effect, restore the Palestinians after the destruction of this war. They will not want to look like they're coming in at Israel's request or coming in to sort of salvage the Israelis. So the PA has a role to play, but the PA is dysfunctional, corrupt, is quite weak because of that, lacks real legitimacy. The PA will have to play a role, but the PA has to go through a process of reform before it can really play a role. It can make the request for others to come in on the grounds that they're saving Palestinians, rescuing Palestinians. But their role is going to be a secondary one to begin with, because they're not capable of playing a different role at this point. Now, it is important that they carry out reform, and it is important that a reform PA does come back in and takes what amounts to a handoff from some kind of transitional administration that is both regional and international in character. And that can set the stage for a reform PA to come in. The PA certainly, as part of a reforming process, can play a role in the ground up in Gaza. In fact, Palestinians will have to play that role. But as you know, Jonathan, there are probably 50 to 60,000 Palestinians who were part of the Palestinian Authority before the Hamas coup in 2007 and remained in a functional role, dealing with the day-to-day issues of health, dealing with the day-to-day issues of electricity, of water. There are 50 to 60,000 who have a functional role and whom the Kogat, which is the Israeli entity that deals with the occupied territories, Kogat already has a relationship with them because they coordinated a lot of what existed before October 7, 2023, and even have coordinated with them in the aftermath of that. So there will be a Palestinian role. There will even be a kind of secondary Palestinian Authority role, but it will have, but a real leadership role there, which at some point will be necessary, will have to wait until we've seen a real, genuine transformation and a reform of the Palestinian Authority.
Thanks for that. And I wanted to then move to the region a little bit and maybe sort of flag your most recent article in Foreign Affairs on Saudi Arabia in particular, on Biden's moonshot, as the title was. But there was a clarifying question that we have in the chat that I thought maybe is worth coming into, although I'll return to the questions and answers a little bit later for the audience. But someone asked, will any Arab state truly use its soldiers to suppress Hamas? So perhaps there's a clarifying element you want to.
Oh, look, this is a very fair question. There will have to be, will Arab forces that come in, will they be prepared to impose on Hamas if even if Hamas isn't the military, they still have small pockets of people and a lot of people who still have arms. If they're a threat to law and order there, will those who are coming in as a stabilization force crack down on them? They say they will. It is a fair question to ask because one can also imagine many of them coming in may want certain understandings from Hamas that there will not be resistance to this force or administration that comes in. I wouldn't be surprised at all if they do seek certain understandings, and that I think a lot depends upon the character of those understandings. If it's understandings that are designed to allow Hamas to make a comeback, it's not acceptable. If there's understandings that allow the rebuilding of Hamas with no diversion of materials and in a sense it's a reconstruction for demilitarization, it's something else. I cite the absence of support for Hamas, the understanding of the Arab forces coming in that there is not support for Hamas, as creating a context where they may be more likely to try to impose on Hamas. And Hamas, for its own reasons, may decide this is not the time to resist. It's one thing to be resisting the Israelis, it's something else to be resisting Arab forces that are very likely to be welcomed by a population that is largely devastated and exhausted and needs not just a respite, but needs some chance to begin to restore some semblance of normal life. If Hamas is seen as trying to block that, I suspect that you're going to find that there will be more support for a crackdown on those who would be doing this than one might imagine under different circumstances.
And in that respect, just sort of thinking about this, I mean, there's the complications of potentially a role for Qatar moving forward. Obviously, it's a key part of the ongoing negotiation process, which is at least failed or maybe possibly can be revived in this circumstance. But what role do you see for Qatar in particular?
Look, it's a complicated one. Some of it depends on what you were just raising. Is there an effort to try to reconstitute what was an agreement that seemed to be close to achievement on 3 phases of hostage releases? It's not at all clear to me who can make decisions right now on behalf of Hamas. The entire leadership around Sinwar, it's not just Sinwar, it's the whole cadre around him, they're gone. And we also know that hostages are held by different groups and different factions. So who is capable of making decisions? I will say this, the external Hamas, those who basically have been residing in Qatar, they certainly are much more susceptible to pressure than what was the Sinwar internal Hamas. So there are those, including within the Biden administration, who want to push now to try to in a sense, bring back to life, resuscitate what was the framework agreement that they had. And I think that's understandable. The question I have is, who can actually deliver? If it is the external Hamas that's capable of delivering now, then Qatar will be important. If it's not the external Hamas that's capable of delivering now, then a very different approach is probably required. And I would flip it. Up until now, the administration approach had been get a hostage deal that creates a pause, allows you to structurally fix the humanitarian situation and needs, and creates a pause so that you can end the war, or at least the Saudis are prepared to close a deal with us to normalize with Israel. They need a pause to be able to do that. So what they would say, they need an end to the war to be able to do that. There was a sense in the administration, you get a hostage deal, the hostage deal sets in motion a humanitarian answer, and it sets in motion the ability to end the war because you end up having a Saudi-Israeli deal. The problem with that approach, while logical and even moral because of the focus on the hostages, was that it made Yahya Sinwar the arbiter of whether or not you could succeed. And it was never clear that he necessarily had an interest in that deal. I mean, his position and Hamas' position was always end the war, then we can release the hostages, not the other way around. Now, the interesting thing is, maybe we're at the point where you can end the war, but the condition is you have to release the hostages. That would be, I think, an alternative way to go. Maybe you pursue these in parallel. But I think from an Israeli standpoint, it's probably easier for Netanyahu, given his coalition, to be able to declare, I'm ending the war provided the hostages are released. He's not seen as forsaking the hostages, and he's not engaging in what would be the kind of process that was previously envisioned, where you had 3 stages and where he had to be releasing very high value, meaning in Palestinian eyes, but well, a lot of blood on their hands, Palestinian prisoners, which was not going to be a popular thing and which was resisted by key members of his coalition, including Sinwar and Smotrich, who said they wouldn't stay in the government if that were the case. So, maybe you pursue both, but my suspicion is there's probably a greater chance if you're focusing on ending the war and you justify that in terms of the achievements.
Well, thanks for that. And maybe just sort of moving across the Gulf and back to what I wanted to talk about your article and about the Saudi normalization and the prospects for Saudi normalization as a sort of grand strategy approach, maybe way out of this situation and how you remake the Middle East. I mean, how likely is that? Given where we were, which was only a couple of months ago when you wrote that, compared to where we are now and what we've seen with Hezbollah and Iran and this sort of pending Israeli retaliation now for Iran's retaliation where do you see that prospect and in terms of the U.S. policy options moving forward as well?
Look, I think the administration has not changed its view, that it still wants to do this. And you can understand an administration that's about to end would like to conclude with what is a major achievement. And the irony is getting a defense treaty passed by the Senate requires 67 votes. Should Trump win, he can't get to 67 votes in the Senate. Biden probably can as his last act, but the irony is that for some of the Democratic senators who otherwise would be reluctant to do it, if there's a Palestinian dimension to the normalization deal, which in all likelihood there will have to be, they will actually rationalize supporting it on the basis not of Israel or Saudi Arabia, but on the basis of producing something for the Palestinians. And obviously there are many others for whom it's Israel that is crucial to all this. So A, the administration's view hasn't changed. B, the Saudi view hasn't changed. They still want it. And they still want it because they get for them, they get a defense treaty as part of it with us. One of the striking things is there's always been this historical view, or we've heard in the last decade, the Arabs just don't trust the U.S. And my answer to that lately has been, so explain to me, if that's the case, why is it the Saudis want a defense treaty? We haven't adopted a bilateral defense treaty in 60 years. It's not something we do very often. We don't have one with Israel. We have a series of MOUs with Israel. But the Saudis would get a legally binding defense treaty as part of doing this. And they want that because they see it as kind of a guarantee against threats from Iran. So is this possible still? The answer is we want it, the Saudis want it. I have a hard time believing that Bibi doesn't want it. I think Bibi does want it because here would be kind of the ultimate vindication of him being, in the end, someone who's able to transform the landscape of the Middle East in the context of just having reduced dramatically the threats from Hamas, the threats from Hezbollah, and especially with regard to Hezbollah, dramatically weakening what the Iranians call the axis of resistance. Now, you're right to point out that Israel hasn't yet retaliated for the October 1 launching of 200 ballistic missiles against Israel. 181 actually had to be intercepted, 19 imploded and did not have to be. But that's obviously, we don't know yet exactly the nature of Israel's response, although we can kind of anticipate what it will be. What does Iran do in response to what the Israelis do? We have a paradox here because both want to make a statement, neither wants a continuing war. For me, what's important for Israel, I think Israel does have to retaliate. Iran cannot think it can do that and get away with no consequence. But the essence, if Israel doesn't want to turn this into a continuing tit for tat, and given the fact that it still is in Lebanon, it still is in Gaza, what Israel should be trying to do is carrying out a set of strikes that will remind Iran how much more Israel could do and how vulnerable the regime actually is. For me, that means suppressing a lot of the air defense, going after the missile producing factories, because unlike all the missiles that Hezbollah had, the long range missiles that Iran has number in the low thousands. They don't have an endless supply. And we know, they've now expended 315. So if you go after the missile producing factories, you can, in a very literal, practical way, you can reduce what they're capable of doing. If you've limited their air defense, you're reminding them how vulnerable they are. And if you do something significant on cyber at the same time, you can again remind them that things could be a whole lot worse for them if they insist on retaliating in a way that would force Israel to do much more. I think that set of criteria or calculus that I was describing, I think that's what's going to guide what the Israelis do.
Interesting. And then one from the chat that's just on this point too. So would Iran allow some sort of agreement between the US and the Saudis to go forward?
I don't think they can prevent it. I think, again, it's a good question because one of the factors that motivated, at least in terms of timing, that motivated Sinwar October 7, 2023, was the increasing speculation that we were on the brink of an agreement between the Saudis and Israelis to normalize, which would have transformed the region very heavily against Iran and the axis of resistance, actually what I call the axis of misery, because everybody who's part of it has a public that is totally miserable, with no hopes and no prospect. But if the Iranians were in a position to do a lot more to resist it, they might. But the Iranians have also just suffered extraordinary setbacks. People don't tend to fully appreciate how important Nasrallah was to the Iranian axis, how important Hezbollah was. Hezbollah trained all the Arab militias. I was about to say Shia, but it wasn't only Shia because Hamas is Sunni. Hezbollah is the one that basically helped all of them, whether they're the Hamas, the Houthis, Saif al-Haq in Iraq, or the Badr organization in Iraq, or even Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq. It trained all of them. It built up all their local defense production. People tend to forget the Iranians don't always speak Arabic. Well, Hezbollah did. In Nasrallah's case, Nasrallah, even when there was disagreement among the Shia militias in Iraq, he's the one who mediated and worked things out among them. He was a charismatic figure for the Shia throughout the region. His demise is a much bigger loss for Iran than I think is fully appreciated. Iran has to decide, what else it can actually do and how vulnerable it is. Its most important asset has been largely, I'll put it this way, they're in complete disarray. Just to put this in perspective, yes, they're still able to launch like 100 rockets into northern Israel. Well, the presumption before this was they had 150,000 rockets hitting Israel with 3,000 to 4,000 rockets a day for at least a month was taken as a given. Those 3,000 to 4,000 rockets could have saturated the Israeli missile defenses. Those 3,000 to 4,000 rockets had a range to cover most of Israel, had payload that was serious in terms of the bomb loads. And the expectation was even people in Tel Aviv would be living in bomb shelters for a month. Tel Aviv, life is normal. Life in Jerusalem is normal. So yes, in the north it's not yet, but because the command and control is gone, because the whole leadership cadre is gone, because the communications can't be trusted because of what Israel has done, because most of the fighters are sort of dealing with their own self-defense, and because it appears that Israel may have, out of the 150,000 rockets, they may have destroyed 2/3 of them. Well, that still leaves 50,000. So it's an interesting question. Why is it that so few are being fired? And why is it the only place they're really being fired is into northern Israel? That says more about what Israel's done to decimate capacity, to give orders, to make decisions. It's quite revealing, I think. And it's created a circumstance where the Lebanese government has a chance to reassert its sovereignty over the state and no longer have the sovereignty, in a sense, completely constrained by a non-state actor like Hezbollah.
Thank you very much. We'll get back to this in the Q&A. I can already see it's being populated with a number of different, very specific Iran questions. But I thought just in this sort of general presentation phase of the event here, maybe I could push you a little bit on the internal Israeli scene a little bit. You and I, we've talked quite a bit over the year about the reckoning in Israeli politics, the future of Israeli politics, Netanyahu's own role, as being whatever sort of tactical victories he has right now, he was at the helm of Israel's, worst military disaster in its history. So, what are the consequences of that moving forward? And then also, we talked about the hostages. And, again, there's a sense maybe in the United States and reading the papers that this is just one of many other sort of tactical issues. But maybe you could give us a sense what it's like inside Israel. I mean, this is a serious, incredibly divisive and emotional issue that has ramifications for the political future of the country. So maybe if you could go a little bit on the internal scene in Israel.
Look, I think if you look at the current polls, you'll see that Bibi has gotten a boost. That shouldn't be surprising. What if he doesn't translate this into political outcomes, that boost will be short-lived. And by the way, even if he does translate it into political outcomes, I don't think one should assume that the current boost is necessarily something that will be enduring. The October 7th hasn't disappeared. In fact, in some ways, it remains October 7th, 2023 in Israel to this day, because the hostages are still being held. And there are pictures. If you go to Israel, you'll see the pictures of hostages everywhere you go. I don't care what city or town you're in, you will see pictures of the hostages everywhere you go. If there isn't, right now, you keep hearing 101 hostages. It would be surprising if there's as many as 50 who are still alive. There'll be no, quote, total victory if the remaining hostages don't come back alive. And they will have stories to tell about how hellish, almost unimaginable the conditions have been for them. And it will not, and they're not going to be telling happy stories about thank you for the rescue. they're going to be asking questions. Why did it take so long? So this will be heart-wrenching. Uh, and if there isn't a hostage deal, or it takes longer, and the number continues to shrink, that too will end up having a political consequence. So the recent achievements need to be translated politically. If they're not, that will aid the reckoning. How the hostages, how many are able to return alive will be a big deal, and what they're saying will be a big deal. And there's just a larger memory that there should be a kind of reckoning. There should be accountability. One of the reasons it's still October 7th, 2023, for most Israelis, it's not just the issue of the hostages. It's also, why did it take the IDF 8 hours to get to the south? There's been no explanation for that. There's also been no accountability for those, who are responsible for what was the worst day in Israel's history. And that's in the military echelon, but it's also in the political one. So all this still has to play out. Look, Prime Minister Netanyahu has a base of support that, I would say, is probably 25% of the country that will be with him regardless. But that's a large number of people who are not. And certainly there's no more, at a maximum, 10% of the country that supports Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. That's on the high end of support for them. And then there's also the whole question of the draft of the Haredi. Supreme Court, on a 9-0 decision, 3 of the 9 wear kippah. 80% of the Israeli public supported the decision that the Haredi have to be drafted. 80%. When you consider that the Haredi population is probably 15%, that tells you over and above them, there's not a whole lot of support. And people tend to forget. I mean, they say, okay, but there's the right-wing nationalists and so forth. There are the right-wing, and many of them are sort of national religious. And when I say national religious, I don't mean it in terms of the Ben-Gvir party. I mean it in terms of they are nationalists and they're religious, and they're not necessarily identified with that party. They might identify with people like Naftali Bennett or Gideon Sa'ar or even Lieberman, but these are people who, in Gaza or in Lebanon, they're there with people who are left-wingers, who live in Tel Aviv, or entirely secular. And they have one thing in common. They're taking care of each other in battle, and they know one thing. They've also been called up 3 or 4 times, and they can see the inequality, the lack of burden sharing, the fact that they're asked to carry such a heavy load. The notion that issue won't be prominent in the next election, I think, ignores how much this has affected everybody in Israel at a time, by the way, where the financial cost of the war is very high. New taxes are being imposed, new value-added taxes are being imposed, and those serving in the reserves are being asked to serve up to the age of 50, and instead of 2 weeks, they're being asked to do 2 months. And so the notion that somehow that's not going to express itself politically, I think, is an illusion. I just think we're going to see a change in Israel. It doesn't mean you could still have Prime Minister Netanyahu in a different government without the messianic right that's there now. But I would even say, that even that could be seen as some sort of transitional basis. Think back to 1973. In 1973, there was an election in December. The war ended the end of October. There was an election in December. The Labor Party still won, although by a reduced number. The Argonaut Commission came out, I think, in late March, early April. Didn't call for the resignation of the Prime Minister and the Defense Minister, meaning Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan. But the reservists hit the streets in tens of thousands, demanding that they go too, and so they both resigned. Now, Rabin was out of, had not been part of this. He ends up replacing Golda as the prime minister. But by 1977, Rabin has resigned because of what would look quaint today, because his wife Leah had a bank account in the United States at the time, which was a carryover from when he had been the prime minister, but you weren't allowed to have a bank account outside of Israel at the time. So when it was discovered that she had it, and he didn't even know, he assumed responsibility and he resigned. Menachem Begin ends up winning an election essentially against Shimon Peres. And I raise this because this is 77. It was a political social transformation. It was in many ways the delayed reaction to what happened in 73. I expect something similar here. Maybe you'll have, again, a transitional election before you have an election where the faces are very different. I believe we're going to see people from the Israeli high-tech industry who prior to the war ignored politics, except they began to pay more attention because of the judicial reform. I think they will now feel you can no longer afford to ignore politics.
Well, thanks so much for that very thorough and historic answer. Very interesting. I think maybe just one element, and one of our participants on online raised it. Maybe one element you didn't cover was about the sort of immediate opposition, in particular the role of Benny Gantz as an individual. He says the question is, at one point he seemed a potential successor to Bibi, but he's been silent recently. What's your take on that, on the scheme, on the scene, also involving potentially Lapid and even Naftali Bennett potentially?
Look, I think that the country has moved to the right on security because they lost their sense of security. They also lost a lot of faith in the military leadership. Now there's signs that that's being restored. Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot were part of the war cabinet. Then they withdrew from it in June. They left the government. I think that the irony is since he pulled out of the government, his numbers in the polls have gone down. He was seen for a lot of people as a unifier. That was a source of attraction. He was seen as, by many people on the right who were no longer prepared to support Netanyahu, he was a place where they could park themselves, saying, look, we won't be for Netanyahu, but we can be for him, even though he's more of a centrist and he's not really who we see, but he's a decent guy and he's a unifier. He still, I think, has that category. It's interesting when you look at polling, even after the most recent events, you still see the opposition has more than the existing coalition, even though the gap has shrunk. It is interesting when the polls say, what if Naftali Bennett comes in and organizes a party? The numbers change dramatically. And I think it's because he's still seen by people on the right as someone who fundamentally identifies with them, and he's not Bibi. And the most recent poll I saw on a Friday said that were he to come in, you would get to 64 or 65 without the Arabs, without Mansour Abbas. And you'd get into, if you're counting the whole opposition, you'd be over 70. So, one can in Israel, we've learned one thing about the polls. Your best day of polling is usually your first day when you have a party, and it goes down from there. But I think something has changed. October 7th changed the political blocks as we knew them. Basically there was movement within the blocks, but not between them prior to October 7th. That's why you had 5 elections. And even the one that put this government in power, if the Labor Party had joined with Meretz, it would have been 60-60. They lost. What happens if you fall just short of 4%, none of those votes count and they shift over, and that distorted what was the outcome. It would have been basically a 60-60 outcome. had merits, and labor joined, and the head of labor at that time did not want to join, thought that that labor would be stronger running independently. So, the reality is what happened after October 7th was you saw a move from the right to the center politically. And the move was, probably 5 to 10 mandates. That's huge in a context where you've been basically split down the middle. And I don't think, even though, as I said, there's a short-term boost for Netanyahu right now, I will be surprised unless he can cap it. Look at what if he goes ahead and he ends the war and then he does a deal with the Saudis? That I think would change things. But for him to do that, he has to give up the right wing of his coalition. So even that represents a fundamental change in terms of Israel's orientation.
Oh, thanks very much. Okay, so moving back to the sort of broader geostrategic issue here, I'll sort of paraphrase a few of the questions that have come in, and in particular, is there a future really with Hamas, Hezbollah existing in any form? I mean, is this something that Israel will allow? Does that seem to be their goal to do their best? Is it even possible? And also, why is the international community seemingly accepting of this reality where the two could sort of potentially reconstitute themselves?
Look, I think I think we have to look at it this way. We defeated and we decimated ISIS, but you couldn't eradicate ISIS. You're dealing with ideologies. Ideologies can wane, they can become discredited, but they don't simply disappear. In the case of Hamas and Hezbollah, each of them have followings for a reason. They offer ideologies that provide an explanation for why things are bad, and they provide a prescription for how they can fix it. When Hamas ran for election in 2006 and won, its slogan wasn't resistance. Its slogan was Islam's the answer. They were dealing with frustration and corruption and the like, and they didn't run on the basis of vote for us because we're going to engage in a war with Israel. They didn't run on that. Now they will be held, at least in Gaza, responsible for having brought all this on the people of Gaza. So they will be weakened, just like Hezbollah will be weakened. Both of them had the dawah, meaning they had a social trust, which they invested in. And that meant that certainly in Lebanon, the Shia, who have always been a kind of underclass, who always treated that way. The reality is that they have a social connection. So they're not going to simply disappear. But there's a big difference between them being in a position where they don't have to be in power, but they determine through their arms what can be done and not done. They have to be weakened to the point where they no longer can dictate what is the future. So I think what the international community is basically saying is, let's see in Lebanon if we can bring the war to an end, where, by the way, if you're Israeli, look, Bibi Netanyahu doesn't want to stay in Lebanon. It's a very unhappy experience staying in Lebanon for 18 years. Staying in Lebanon would be the surest way to help Hezbollah re-legitimize itself in terms of they represent resistance to quote occupation. So Israel does not want to stay there. But the approach has to be one in Lebanon where Security Council Resolution 1701 said no Hezbollah below the Litani River, and it said no replenishment of arms. The UNIFIL was supposed to be robust and to have a very potent rules of engagement. UNIFIL never operated the way it was supposed to. Hezbollah dominated the south. it completely remilitarized the South. Hezbollah could go where it wanted, when it wanted. UNIFIL could only go where it wanted when Hezbollah allowed it to go where it wanted. So there has to be, the ground rules again have to be reconstituted. So no militarization, no Hezbollah role below the Litani, no weapons coming in from Syria. And we should endorse the idea that if there's any violation whatsoever, we support the Israelis acting militarily immediately in response. So you prevent a rebuilding, but it will also be quite a strong deterrent, especially you have a Lebanese government that says we don't want to give the Israelis an excuse to have to be coming back into Lebanon. I think in Gaza, it's much the same. Although we talked about it a little bit earlier, I think there the context is different because I think there really is genuine anger. Obviously, there's anger against Israel for what it's done, but it's pretty clear there's a lot of anger towards Hamas as well.
Thank you very much. I think maybe we've got a good question here that actually fits well, and I'll just read it. It says, "Do you believe that the Lebanese armed forces can truly take control of southern Lebanon, given that the Lebanese state exercises no real sovereignty? Is Israeli management of the threat through regular incursions a better choice?"
I think that, first of all, the idea of regular incursions is different than staying in Lebanon. I think the threat of regular incursions will create a very powerful deterrent. And I think it needs to be part of any agreement of reestablishing or reinvigorating 1701. There needs to be an unmistakable understanding that someone is going to enforce it because it was never enforced. And the only ones who have credibility of enforcing it, since others will always explain why you can't, is the Israelis. Because that's the only way you're going to get the people, 68,000 Israelis, to move back to the north. I think as it relates to Gaza, we had this discussion already. I do think it's one thing to resist the Israelis, it's something else to resist Arab forces who are coming in because the local population wants them to come in. By the way, if that's the case, the local population won't be serving Hezbollah. It'll be telling these international forces, if Hezbollah is trying to do something, they'll be the first ones to inform on them. That's a totally different context than we've seen.
And then maybe again to sort of paraphrase a couple of the questions, in particular on Iran and Israel's long-term goals. Is Israel's long-term goal a regime change in Iran, or at least to influence a regime change? What do they hope to gain out of this direct exchanges that we have now?
I mean, Bibi has, made his appeal to the Iranian public. I wouldn't count on that appeal having a huge impact. The truth is, the Iranian public is completely alienated from the regime. I did a doctoral dissertation on Soviet decision making, and the situation in Iran today is very similar to the situation in the Soviet Union in 1980-81. The ideology was believed by nobody except the people who were in power, who were served by it. That's what you have in Iran today. No one buys the ideology. No one believes in the ideology. And the level of anger towards the regime includes the rural areas that were always the backbone of support for the regime because of the killing brutalization of Masa Amini, who was 2 years ago, who was 21-year-old Kurdish young woman who ended up being killed because she was wearing her hijab, wearing it inappropriately, supposedly. So you can talk about regime change, but regime change comes from within. Any effort to impose regime change from without has a pretty unhappy history. So I think the Israelis would love to see a different Iran regime. I think there's an understanding they can't produce it. But what can be done, and this is really going to be an issue for the next administration. President Biden said the Iran will not get a nuclear weapon on his watch. Had he had a second term, he would have had to deal with that because there's a very real possibility they could produce a nuclear weapon in the next administration. So whether it's Harris or it's Trump, they're going to have a policy for dealing with this. I do think the good news is Iran is weaker than it was and knows it's weaker than it was. That may make it more susceptible to the right kind of pressure.
Thank you. And then another question on international pressure and the trajectory of the war. Maybe, this other side of trying to help us better understand the decision-making process in Israel. I think we've seen a couple of things that appear unprecedented, at least the pressure from the United States conditioning weapons on Israel, requiring more humanitarian aid to enter Gaza, for example. And even before, it seems like a million years ago, but even, taking us back to early part of 2023, there was actually a robust dialogue about maybe changing the approach to U.S. support to Israel in terms of the weaponry, et cetera. How do you, maybe it's a two-part question, how do you see any future U.S. administration going? Which direction do you see them going with that? And then how is this viewed from Israel's point of view?
On the one hand, look, the Israelis hate to be in a position where they are so dependent on us that they can be influenced by real pressure from us. But we're in a different world than we were before. The Israeli ethos of we defend ourselves by ourselves no longer exists. The ethos may exist, but the reality of it doesn't exist. On the night of April 13th, the U.S. and its Central Command, with a number of partners, including air partners, intercepted 1/3 of what was fired against Israel. Not the ballistic missiles, but there were over 200 cruise missiles and drones. 1/3 of those were intercepted by the U.S. and the Central Command partners, meaning this wasn't just us providing support, this was active intervention on Israel's behalf. And it made Israel's task simpler because 1/3 of what was being fired at it didn't have to deal with. Now, on the night of October 1st, here again, the U.S. was active in terms of helping to intercept what was fired against Israel. Obviously, there was some concern about not being as effective on October 1st as the defense was on the night of April 13th. So we've now deployed a THAAD battery to Israel, which helps to close gaps that might have existed in the integrated missile defense network that Israel has. So this is not a case of, well, gee, we'll provide you weapons, we'll provide support, but you do all your own fighting. We now have two examples of where there was active U.S. military intervention on behalf of Israel, helping Israel defend itself. That's just different. And as Israel faces all these fronts, this is not a luxury. This is much more of a necessity. So you don't get to have it both ways, where you depend on American intervention, at least in part, but then you can ignore what the U.S. says or what the U.S. thinks. So Israel's in a different place. It needs to think through what that means. I think the next president needs to sit with the Israelis, and we need to come up with, strategically, let's look at our interests strongly converge. You remain the only democracy in the region. The fact is, you're the one facing on the front lines the threats from those who also threaten us. So, we're going to converge most of the time, but there will be times when you will do things that affect our interests. One of the reasons I can tell you there has been increasing unhappiness within the American military. So we have forces in the Middle East, and Israeli actions can subject them to responses or to attacks. Being surprised means we're less capable of defending our own forces. And so there needs to be more understanding on that that is worked out. Look, the scope of support that the Biden administration provided is unprecedented and extraordinary. They imposed all sorts of emergency regulations so they wouldn't have to do what you normally have to do when we provide arms. Normally there's a real legal process and there's a series of legal steps you have to take. All those were dispensed with on the basis of emergency declarations by the president. So the level of support has been quite extraordinary, but also it opens up Israel to not simply ignoring what are U.S. concerns, because U.S. interests are also engaged and U.S. personnel are also affected. So it's not the traditional position where Israel always said, just, and Bibi said it when he appeared before the Congress, you give us the means, we do our own fighting. And the Israelis have never asked for the U.S. to come and fight for them. But in this administration, under Central Command, we actually have. And it's because of that precedent, it's very hard to believe that that won't be true from now on. But when that's true, in addition to the scope of the resupply, which affects our own stocks, the combination of providing for Israel and providing for Ukraine, it's created a real strain. So there has to be a different kind of, at least a different level of strategic understandings where we carve out, how we will approach things, and also reach understandings on, if we don't agree, how are we going to manage when we don't agree.
Thanks very much. I think we have time just to squeeze one more in. And again, thank you so much for your time. You mentioned you just sort of ended by talking about Biden, and no matter what, we're going to have a new administration next year in January. What do you see as the sort of provided Biden's inclined to do something? What's his move in that lame duck period that we'll enter into in about a week or so, in about 2 weeks or so? What's the best thing that Biden can do, and potentially to sort of secure up the legacy, but also to really impact a sort of more peaceful, more stable future in the region?
First of all, these interregnums are times when outgoing administrations are quite free. The Reagan administration recognized the PLO during the interregnum, after Bush was elected, but before he was inaugurated. Barack Obama, acquiesced, allowed a pretty bad Security Council resolution to be adopted during the interregnum, mostly because there was a kind of anger level at Bibi. So presidents have a much freer hand. I think here there's a strong case to be made. Look, Biden will want to go out having ended the war and with a real achievement, especially if you can do the Saudi deal. He'll want to do that. Whether he's able will remain to be seen, because it doesn't depend only on us. But if he's able, that's a big thing. But I would say, interesting enough, people should not underestimate Bibi's interest in doing deals with Biden during that period. He doesn't know what he gets with either Harris or Trump. He knows what he has with Biden. He knows the next MOU, which is a 10-year memorandum of understanding on assistance, where the needs for Israel are going to be greater than they've been. He knows that's going to have to be negotiated in 2025. I could see him seeking a deal and wanting certain understandings about guidelines for that next MOU. If it's Harris, she then inherited. If it's Trump, he won't want to be seen as doing less than Biden. So I think that intervening period, we could actually see significant agreements or significant deals.
Thank you so much. Really incredibly enlightening and a lot of food for thought. And as I suspected, definitely helps us better understand this increasingly complicated moment. Thank you so much, Ambassador Ross.
Glad to do it.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.